Letters on the back of a car can evoke a wealth of emotions. D usually means diesel, L and GL on your company car show where you are on the corporate pecking order. But for petrol heads, there are other letters that spark a bit more interest. Letters like a small case I, especially when used with the GT. V shows there's something large and powerful underneath the bonnet. But Ford of Europe have reserved the letters R and S for some of the most powerful road cars they've ever produced. Join me and Steve Saxty, who knows one or two things about Ford RS cars after writing 2 volumes on the history of European Fords, as we dive into the first 3 decades of Ford's rally sport story. Rallying goes back to the early days of cars when the rich hoi polloi would race their new expensive playthings in increasingly challenging competitions around the world. By 1900, rallying was being used to introduce more people to the novelty of cars by racing cars across whole countries. Car racing progressed to racetracks where the public could get a better view and promoters could charge for the privilege, but rallying never really went away. The Monte Carlo Rally started in 1911, went from strength to strength after the Second World War as more people had free time to watch rallying, and the idea of owning a car was less a pipe dream and something that was becoming a reality. Car companies took notice and works teams started to dominate, turning their family cars into fire-breathing track cars so they could win on Sunday and sell on Monday. Ford's fortunes were on the rise in the 1960s with increasingly well put together cars that the public wanted. Their marketing team was always on the lookout for ways to get their name in the papers or on the TV. They collaborated with Lotus on the Ford Cortina Lotus in 1963 with promotional stunts like Jim Clark driving down the Winter Olympic bobsleigh run in Cortina. But on track, the occasionally 3-wheeled Cortina dominated. Over in Germany, Ford's GM-funded rival Opel had sporty models of their own, and Ford took notice. I'll let Steve explain.
Well, it's fair to say RS really started as a reaction to what was an Opel, a pair of Opel cars that were launched in '67, and they were the new range of sporty Opels. There was the Cadet Rallye and the Record Sprint. So they had Rallye Sprint as the Opel brand, and Ford needed a quick response for their equivalent models to the Cadet and to the Record in Germany. And so they used to use Touring Sport, TS. And so they basically moved things forward from TS to RS. And so to take on what was Rallye Sprint was Rallye Sport.
The first Ford to wear the RS Rallye Sport name was the German Ford Taunus in 1967. Winning the 1969 East African Rally certainly helped sales. The Go Faster stripes made it look the business, but it was the larger engine that drew customers. Back in Britain, the Cortina was still racing and winning, but Ford saw more potential in the new, lighter Ford Escort. They also wanted a new name for their sporty cars, a brand name to identify them as thoroughbred cars from Ford's motorsport stable. Ford started conversion work with longtime racing partner Lotus, making the Escort twin cam, but their work with Cosworth in Formula 2 took them in another direction. Cosworth had added a 16-valve head to the Cortina 1.6-litre engine, developing 220 horsepower. What if it was fitted to the new Escort? A detuned 115 horsepower version appeared for the 1970 model year as the Escort RS 1600, sold by new dedicated rally sport dealers. It was soon winning events like the grueling London to Mexico Rally, and Ford would celebrate with a special Escort Mexico edition. Ford introduced the American-styled Capri Coupe in 1969, and it seemed like the perfect car to get the RS treatment, especially as the Escort RS wasn't catching on in Germany, Ford's second largest market. The new V6 RS 2600 entered the European Touring Car Championships and was of course sold to hungry Capri customers. It didn't need the extra marketing at this point though. Capris were flying out of showroom doors. Making sporty versions with an extra profit margin was always helpful to Ford's bank balance. The Escort RS1600 grew to become the RS200 in 1972, although with less power now its 16-valve engine had been reduced to just 8 valves. A faster Capri RS3100 arrived in 1973, now with the steering wheel on the right, so others could enjoy the fun that Continental drivers have been having for years. But these were pricey cars designed to appeal to the motorsport fan with a healthy bank balance. And so, like all previous performance Ford models, these were produced in very small numbers. A year later, in 1974, Ford thought to put the RS3100's chassis together with a 2.8-litre V6 installed in Capris destined for America and fuel injection to produce something truly special. It was pitched as the next RS Capri, but the fuel crisis got in the way. No one was thinking about big engines burning lots of petrol. People wanted fuel economy. The idea was put on the back burner. It was never cancelled, but even with an updated look, it couldn't get approval. Eventually, the project was shelved as the financial projections just didn't make sense. With the RS brand selling regular cars, Ford even considered a top-of-the-range Ford Granada RS, but it hit the same roadblocks as the Capri RS2800.
They toy with it. I mean, it's the same problem, same time, really, in truth. And there's always an issue where you can only go so far with the pieces you've got of an engine range. And the most powerful engine was the fuel-injected 2.8 that was not yet fitted to the Granada, but was available in the American-size 2.8-litre block with the fuel injection system from the old Capri RS2600, the same engine that would have been in the Capri. And to put it into the Granada, they were toying with doing a coupe version of the upcoming Mark II, and it could have gone in that. And it would have made a lovely car. There are all sorts of coupe Granada alternatives I've seen, and it's one of those cars that sort of was a little bit dying to happen. But the problem is market research always seemed to suggest that RS, it needs to stay fairly close to motorsport, and the more you drift out to executive cars, it's maybe not, you know.
Despite the fuel crisis, there was still a market for Escort RS models, so with the advent of the Mark II Escort, work started on a new RS version. Ford had been paying attention to the work Wayne Cherry was doing over at Vauxhall, converting the Viva into the sporty droop snoot Firenze. This dynamic shape set the pulse racing and customers racing to the showroom. Ford stylists knew they had to make their own. Slowly, the new RS2000 took shape in the summer of 1974 with the same twin headlight setup as the Firenze. 4 eyes might be an insult to a human, but to a car, it's a compliment. The slanted front looked aerodynamic, but it didn't help the car punch much of a hole through the air. The 109 horsepower 2-litre engine was the main reason the car got to 60 in 8.4 seconds, and that was all that mattered for customers. Another hot, exclusive version of one of Europe's most popular cars. And it was well equipped. Ford was discovering that customers wanting speed didn't want a bare-bones car, so it got some of the perks provided in the top-of-the-range gear model. The RS2000 might have won the hearts of customers, but it was the conventionally styled RS1800 that was winning rallies. Rally teams preferred the standard grille as it made attaching additional lights easier, and replacement parts were cheaper. The RS1800 was joined by the 1.6-litre RS Mexico, giving a wealth of sporty options at different price points and a range of groovy 1970s colours. The Capri RS had ended production, but that didn't stop Ford's coach builders Gear from dreaming what a new RS coupe would look like. Although it was called the Capri RS, it was all Mark III Escort, and the RS letters were used to show it was intended to be a fast car. There was a bit of a North American 3-door Escort about it, but at the end of the day there wasn't much difference between this and a regular 3-door hot Escort, so plans were dropped. If Ford could create mad RS versions of the Escort, then why not the smaller Fiesta? Ford experimented by souping up a Fiesta gear with fat wheel arches, a spoiler and some blue highlights. Oh, and of course a twin-carb version of the 1.1-litre engine, an odd choice seeing as a 1.6-litre could fit into the engine bay. Inside it was luxurious. Sporty seats and cassette storage in the doors made the customers a little less shocked when they were told the price. But it was the high price for such an inexpensive little car that made Ford feel there wasn't enough value there, especially when the small engine and front-wheel drive package would have meant the car likely wouldn't have lived up to the RS name. In any case, all eyes were on the Fiesta's bigger brother, the Escort. For the first time, Ford won the World Rally Constructors Championship with, what else, the Escort RS 1800. On top of the world, Ford Motorsport turned to its next rally contender. But there was a problem. The next generation Escort would be front-wheel drive, and as the Fiesta RS proved, front-wheel drive and rallying might have worked with the Mini in the 1960s, but it wouldn't cut it in the 1980s. Some drastic changes were needed to turn a front-wheel drive Escort into a rear-wheel drive rally contender, the Escort RS 1700T.
And it was one of those ideas that absolutely makes no sense whatsoever unless you work in motorsport, and in which case it made total sense, which is to gut the body of the upcoming Escort and fit a rear-wheel drive powertrain and a lot of the chassis components from the outgoing rear-wheel drive car into the new front-wheel drive car. The obvious problem with that is it's not exactly a cheap thing to do. Cars were heading towards production, and it's fair to say it got a lot closer to production than perhaps I realized. And they were having serious conversations as to who could make it, whether it could be Lotus, for example, might have been one of the manufacturers of the car. But time was moving on. There was the Audi Quattro came along, and that rewrote the rule book. And they knew within a year or two, they'd have to turn it from a rear-wheel drive car into a four-wheel drive car. And having turned a front-wheel drive car into a rear-wheel drive car and then back into a four-wheel drive car, the costs are not going to go anything other than up and up and up.
The RS 1700T was cancelled, and the handful of prototypes saw limited rally action in South Africa, but there were RS versions of the Mark III Escort. The Escort RS 1600i launched in 1981 using fuel injection and a slightly more aerodynamic shape to give it roughly the same acceleration as the Mark II RS200. But this was the 1980s, where turbos ruled the roost. Ford added one to the RS 1600i in 1984, giving it another 21 horsepower, and it went racing in the Group A touring car series. The more sedate-looking Mark IV version in the late 1980s refined the turbo lag. Fast sporty models were needed in the showroom, as the Escort was met with real opposition from Volkswagen's Golf GTI. The RS models were now the top of the range, with a price to match. The RS Turbo was almost double the price of the base Ford Escort. This put pressure to add luxury features into the RS range, but more weight always meant slower acceleration, which damaged the sporting credentials. Ford's first RS, the Taunus, had included a sunroof, adding additional weight up high, so impacting the car's acceleration and handling, and something that would never be used on a rally car. Adding heavy extras such as air conditioning would always be a debate, but sometimes it was a matter of practicality. Large air conditioning units simply wouldn't fit under the bonnet after a larger engine and a turbo had been added. Ford had 200 rally spec engines left over from the aborted Escort RS 1700T project. What if they could be used for a next generation rally car, the RS200?
The new man at the top, a guy called Stuart Turner, replaced the outgoing guy, Carl Ludvigsen, who moved on reasonably swiftly. And Stuart's vision was to invent 3 dedicated Group A racing cars, and I think it was for Group B as well. And so the Group B proposition was really the specialist 200 units, and that was the big ask, was to make 200 cars, having cancelled the RS 1700T, as well as Sierra Cosworth was the Group A car and the Escort RS Turbo. So he asked for 3 cars, not really expecting to get all 3 approved, especially the 200 off mid-engine rally car. And that was really what he wanted, was a car that had great visibility, mid-engine for handling, four-wheel drive, which was by then essential. And it had to look like a generic Ford. And that was probably the cleverest bit about that car, was it looked like a Ford, but not any one particular Ford. And that's a really clever way of using the brand to be associated with RS, and Ford in particular, from a road going perspective, is to have a generic Ford feel about it. So it's a very clever piece of design, and Again, it was unlucky, I suppose, because time went against it when Group B was cancelled, and the car never really went on to achieve the success it maybe could have achieved.
If you want to hear more about the RS200, I have a short video about it and there's a link above. With Group B rallying cancelled, Ford needed to go back to what they knew, taking road-going cars rallying to sell more of its mainstream cars. The Sierra had faltered as it left the gates in 1982, and it needed a win, preferably on track, something to make it a car to desire, not ridicule. Ford set their sights on winning the Group A World Touring Car Championships. The XR4i was fast, but it wouldn't cut it, so a hotter RS version was created with a 201 horsepower tuned Ford engine, courtesy of their friends at Cosworth. The RS Cosworth burst onto the scene in 1985, but it would be the more potent 224 horsepower RS500 Cosworth in 1987 that grabbed the headlines and the motorsports trophies. As customers grew used to the new Sierra looks, the RS Cosworth helped the Sierra climb the sales charts. Over in Fiesta land, the warmed-over XR2 had sold well, leading Ford to think maybe they could liven the third-generation car up a little bit more as the Fiesta RS. The starting point was not the Mark III Fiesta XR2i, but the Escort RS Turbo. Both cars shared a 1.6-litre engine, but the larger Escort had a turbo. A smaller turbo would be needed to fit into the Fiesta's tight engine bay, which gave the new Fiesta RS Turbo 22 horsepower more than the XR2. With the S or Sport model being a hot Fiesta and the XR2 being a Fiesta on steroids, the stylist dilemma was how to make a Fiesta on even more steroids without making it look comically overblown. They settled for slightly larger wheels that filled out the enlarged wheel arches and a pair of vents on the bonnet, and of course the all-important RS badge on the back. It would also appear on the Continent, but without the RS badge that didn't have the same cachet. 10 years earlier, Ford had had concerns customers wouldn't pay for a high-end RS Fiesta. Customers didn't warm to the new Fiesta RS, especially with spiralling British insurance premiums brought on by a 1980s joyriding epidemic. The Fiesta RS Turbo was replaced in 1992 by the slightly slower RS1800 as the old CVH engine was being phased out. But in customers' eyes, Fiesta and RS never really went together, and when production ended in 1995, this would be the last Fiesta to wear the RS badge, at least in Europe. South Africa would rebrand the Fiesta Zetec S as the RSI. The Fiesta RS Turbo could be seen as the low point for the RS brand, designed to cash in on the RS name, but with a 0 to 60 time of 7.7 seconds and a top speed of 127 miles an hour, it was hardly a stinker. Ford created the RS brand in the 1960s out of a desire to compete against all comers in motorsport and against Opel in the showroom. By the end of the 1980s, that mandate hadn't changed. Sierra RS models were taking wins in the touring car series, and Fiestas, Escorts and Sierras were providing excitement to not only sell against Vauxhall and Opel, but also give much needed cachet to fight off German luxury competitors. As we'll see in part 2, which will have a link above when I've made it, that fight would continue into the 1990s and beyond, and the Ford Focus would go on to outshine its forerunner, the Escort. No mean feat. Steve goes into a lot more detail on many of these cars, especially the Escort RS1700T in his Secret Fords Volume 1 book, and an RS Special Edition has just been launched. There's a link above and in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.